I have a lot to cover because I want to conclude the last lecture, give the next lecture. It's a busy week, and then I have to be done because the midterm is the next week. So whatever I don't get covered is never going to be covered. All right, first thing I want to tell you, and you will get an email about this, is that there is going to be a link to fill out a very short survey that asks you to rate occupations, and the actual wording is, please judge as best you can the social status of the occupations listed below. For each of the following, give your opinion of its prestige by circling the appropriate number from 5, which is highest, to 1, which is lowest. I would like you to do this as soon as possible. I'm going to aggregate the results from the whole class. It will come with someone else's name on it because a professor at the business school is letting us use her link to something that aggregates the data, so I don't have to do it by hand. So do it as soon as possible because I'm going to talk about the results on Wednesday. So when you get it, do it. And it doesn't ask you for your name, just for your GSI's name, so this really is honor system. But if you do it, you'll understand better one of the elements of the class. So it'll help you in the end also. All right, some students were asking me about the end of the last lecture, so I realized I rushed through it so fast I think some things weren't clear. So the basic point here of the aggregation of all these studies of altruism, aggression, and empathy is that if you look out in the real world, women and men do vary. If you look around you, you would on average think that women were more empathetic than men, that men were systematically more aggressive than women, and you might expect that women would be more altruistic and helpful than men are, although in the systematic surveys, it actually goes the other way. But the point I was making is that those turn out not to be the result of deeply internalized, long-lasting differences in motivation or personality. They are instead, as really careful analysis of all these lab-type experiments shows, related to differences in skills, and this particularly affects the differences in helpfulness, in altruism, because many examples of people needing help require skills that men have practiced and women haven't. An example, we were once at a concert and a guy behind us was crazy or something, and he started hitting the woman next to him who was not related to him. He was something about he wanted the elbow room on his seat, and my husband, who was not a terribly aggressive type person, got up and said to the guy, you know, stop this, you have to get out of, you know, and woo, I wouldn't have come anywhere near it. But I think it was both that he had more of the skills that you would need, and there is more of an expectation that men will take charge when there's an emergency of certain sorts. So what looks like a personality difference is a difference in skills, in the behavioral roles people understand that they are expected to fulfill, and in whether they're aware that they are being observed. So that the empathy finding was a finding that, so remember I said those empathy studies tend to show you a film of someone suffering, of a baby crying, of some other very, you know, intensely painful thing happening to someone else. And again, I said, if you ask people how upset they are, the women claim they're more upset by this than men do. So women experience themselves as more empathetic. But if you attach them to one of those things that measures your pulse rate, how much your palms sweat, the same kind of thing that a lie detector is. So it basically is a machine that measures your physiological arousal. Then the differences are smaller. both women and men are upset, but women somewhat more. But when the women and the men, each individual is completely alone, so they're not in a public setting where others are observing them or they are made aware of their genderedness, then there's no difference in how upset physiologically women and men are. Now, there is a difference in how upset they think they are, so maybe there's a difference at some level in how empathetically they would behave. But I'm just trying to point out that even things that we assume are very deeply embedded features of women and men are highly subject to the situation and the expectations people understand apply to them. Okay. Now, why might these differences really exist? And here I'm pursuing a little bit the same point I made at the beginning when I talked about Martina Horner's study of fear of success. And remember, there the point was that it looked as though women were afraid of success and men relished, were ecstatic about success, but it turned out that women and men were actually observing, if you will, the same social reality, which is that success would be, and again, this was in the early 1970s, late 1960s, right before the women's movement, actually, that success really might be too much or problematic for women, and it really would be just great for guys. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that gender differences, to the degree they are sustained, are partly sustained because women and men, to some degree, still live in different worlds, even when it looks as though they live in the same world. And so I'm going to talk very, very quickly about, first of all, some aspects of romantic relationships. So this applies to heterosexual relationships, and these differences are probably fading with time. But in the classic studies of love and romance, and there were a whole set of very, very creative studies done in the 1970s at the University of Wisconsin. There were a couple of researchers who were interested in this problem. And one thing they did was set up freshman mixers, so huge dances, and then they surveyed everyone at the beginning and the end of the mixer. And it turned out that if you asked the question, who was more romantic, and what they meant by romantic was at the end of the evening, you talked, I think they even randomly assigned people who to dance with or something like that. At the end of that, did you think that person was wonderful? Did you think you could imagine marrying that person? Did you think, you know, that might be a person you could be in love with, and so forth? And it turned out that men were more likely to say, oh yeah, wonderful, she's great, wonderful, wonderful. And here I'm going to be a little bit cynical, but it's true. Essentially, the only thing that mattered is whether the young woman the boy had danced with was nice looking. And if she was nice looking, he was ready to be in love in a minute. Women were much less romantic. They appraised the men more critically and were less sure that this person might work out. A second study was actually even more interesting and very well done. It was a study of 50 couples who were recruited. They were dating couples. This was done in Boston. And it actually produced a book, if you ever want to see it. The first author was a person named Zick, Z-I-C-K, Rubin. But they recruited these 50 couples, and they did all sorts of very clever things. They had a pencil and paper questionnaire on liking and loving, and they showed that people who scored high on the questionnaire about loving also made more eye contact when they were brought into the lab. So they had a machine that measured from two sides of a table at once whether the people were really looking at each other. People who said they loved each other really were looking at each other more. But They also followed these couples until they either got married or broke up, basically. And one of the really fascinating findings is that at the point of the breakup, whether the breakup was initiated by the woman or by the men were much more upset by the breakup than the women were. And so I'm going to ask you why this might be. So think sociologically about this in a situation which was more true then than it is now, although it is still somewhat true, where men earn more than women, where marriage for men represents companionship and intimacy, and access to sex would have been an important ingredient. For women, it involved those things, but also a very significant element of their livelihood. And connected to that imbalance in power was the fact that women were somewhat more dependent on, first, their husband's income, but also on whether their husbands were nice or not, whether he would let her have a career, whether he would let her go out, say, once every couple of weeks in the evening with her girlfriends from high school, whether he would be supportive if she wanted to do something. Whereas he was much less worried about whether she would let him see his friends from high school. And I'm trying to use this in a way that you might see that this is still, you would, in at least some marriages you know, you would not be surprised to hear a woman say, he's just a wonderful husband. He doesn't get upset if I go out in the evening with my girlfriends. He's really supportive of my career. He's really willing to help a huge amount. He does half the childcare. He's just a great guy. He's really nice to my sister. If a woman said that about her husband, he's just such a great guy. Oh, a man said that about his wife. I'm sorry. She's just such a great wife. She doesn't get mad if I go out in the evening with my friends. She's supportive of my career. She helps a tremendous amount with the housework. And she does half the childcare. Okay, so you recognize, it's funny because you actually recognize that even as we've moved toward more egalitarian relationships, women continue to be more dependent on not just whether the guy is cute. That's a tiny part of what women are interested in. Look up young men who are heterosexual and interested in romance. They are very interested in whether the person is nice, in whether he's smart, in whether eventually he's going to be able to do his share of earning a living. And those things make women, of necessity, more realistic and less romantic. And that's what this data showed. The loving and leaving had a similar element, which is, again, if there's a power imbalance in a relationship, and so all along, if the man's not happy with what the woman is like, he's in a better position to get what he wants. Let's imagine this scenario. He loves science fiction and baseball. She loves romantic comedies and ice skating. And so they go to a lot of science fiction movies and see a lot of baseball. And they almost never go to a romantic comedy, and he hates ice skating, tries it once, I mean, not to do it, but to watch it, and never again. Okay, that's what I mean by power imbalance. So he's not as worried by what she wants. It doesn't matter that much. Whereas she may be complaining, saying, you know, you just don't listen to me. You know, I try to tell you about my day and I can tell you're just not listening. I wish we could talk sometime. I wish sometimes you didn't spend so much time at work and you were a little more interested in the family, et cetera, et cetera. By the time they break up, again, it turns out no matter whether it was the man who broke up or the woman is ready to move on. Again, these are averages. I'm not saying you never have a woman who's just so determined to hold on to that guy that she cannot adjust to the idea that it's over. But I think what was going on there is that the power imbalance between women and men meant that when couples broke up, the woman was already fed up, or she could already see the writing on the wall. The guy was shocked. What? I don't understand. There was nothing wrong. It was a great relationship. It was fine. What's she doing? Is she nuts? What is she thinking? So I would say that this is what I'm trying to demonstrate here, is that sometimes, again, what look like personality differences or differences in feeling actually make sense when you understand that there are structural differences that really do put women and men in systematically different worlds for much of the life course. All right, I'm going to deal with these more quickly and just say that along, again, the exact same lines that I've been describing, turns out that over, I think, most of the data on marital happiness shows that married people are happier, meaning more satisfied with their lives. Nobody's able to predict whether people are happy moment to moment, like, ooh, I just feel so good. That kind of happy, we actually have no idea what produces it. And so the economists and sociologists and psychologists have started to study it, and it's a mess. In fact, the only thing that consistently makes people happy in that particular way is breakfast. I kid you not, really, okay? But if you ask people, how happy are you with your life? Basically, how satisfied are you overall? Married people are happier than unmarried people, and they live longer, so that's good. But among women, the mental health of unmarried women is actually better. And I think that is because married women are carrying a disproportionate share of the emotional work that keeps relationships going. These aren't huge differences. It doesn't mean every single woman is, you know, autonomous, happy, free, doesn't have to worry about anything, and every married woman is busy, you know, scraping up the crumbs of the marital conversations and trying to make sure everything stays on an even keel. But you can see why that might be. A second systematic inequality, and I'll just mention this one because it's one of the ones that would be surprising if you never think about it. It has to do with demography, which is, as long as the habitual pattern, and it doesn't matter where it comes from, is that women expect to date or marry men their own age or somewhat older, so that a woman thinks it's perfectly all right if she's a freshman in college to be dating someone who's a sophomore or junior or senior, or maybe even someone in the law school. Doesn't seem too weird. Whereas freshman men are pretty much stuck dating freshman girls unless they have friends from high school in the area or something like that. And it might be okay, might happen occasionally. They date a woman who's a sophomore, but a woman who's a senior is just not likely to be dating someone who's a freshman. And a woman in law school dating a boy who was a freshman in college would be seen by herself and her friends as weird. It's not that it shouldn't ever happen, and actually I'm several years older than my husband, so these things do happen, But they certainly didn't happen when we were freshmen in college. I mean, by the time we were old enough and we met each other, and also, well, I'll just say this, he was ahead of me career-wise, even though he was behind me age-wise, and that probably, if he'd been behind me in age and career, it might not have happened. No, even though he was would have been just as wonderful a person, and he would have been just as great, and, you know, actually, yeah, so what this means, those systematic age gaps are true in college, big time, and I will just, how many of you are freshmen? A lot. Okay, I will predict the following, and again, it may not be as true for you as it was in my generation, but in my generation, freshman girls, I'll call them girls, their mailboxes were full of boy calls. We got little pink, you know, there wasn't voicemail and whatnot, we got little pink slips in our mailboxes when someone had called, and you could just come back and find your mailbox was full, upperclassmen were crashing the freshman mixers, you could be out on a date every single night. By the time you were a senior, you might have a steady boyfriend, but if you didn't, you were highly unlikely to have a huge number of men looking after you. Likewise, freshman boys had a terrible time. No one was, and remember, these are the same boys who, when they were senior in high school, big man on campus. The freshman girls liked them, the sophomore girls liked them, the junior girls liked them, and the senior girls wished the boys would be interested in them. They had all 4 classes to choose from. They go to college as freshmen, and suddenly they can't get a date. Why? Because the girls they might date are being competed for. It's just a systematic reality. So it's not that girls, you know, lose their bloom between age 17 and 21 or 18 and 22. It has nothing to do with that. It is a systematic effect of this tiny, I don't know what to call it, but social expectation that's gendered about the relationship between age and romance, and it produces big systematic effects, not only in college, but out there in the marital market. So I won't go into it, except what I'm trying to get at here is that even when it looks as if men and women must be different in their biology, their genes, their hormones, their brain structures, and that's why they behave so differently, a lot of it is that they actually live in different worlds. Different worlds created by things like this, and by the overall inequalities in the way employment, power, and so forth. Okay, the last thing I want to tell you about is a wonderful study by a guy named Ronald Kessler, who was, well, one of the best social psychologists. He was at NIH for many years, NIMH, I guess, National Institutes of Mental Health. And he did basically the definitive work about differences in depression between women and men. And so it had been known for a long time that women show more symptoms of depression than men do, or in the population there are more women who report being depressed, and there's a fairly straightforward but apparently quite reliable and well-validated scale. And it's things like lying awake at night unable to sleep because you're worried about problems, and I don't know, other symptom scale that measures depression. And so they knew that women are more depressed than men. The question is, are women more depressed than men because of some underlying physiological vulnerability to depression? That's one possibility. Are they more depressed than men because it's okay for women to talk about their feelings and to admit that they feel bad, and men aren't allowed to admit that they feel bad? Or are there things happening to women that cause them to be more depressed? So you can imagine all those possibilities. And what Kessler did was a really brilliant study where he looked at the effect of specific life events. So divorce, losing a spouse through death, So being widowed, losing a job, so major life disruptions. And he looked at how depressed people got after those events. And it turned out that when the same kinds of things happen to women and men, there's actually no difference. They get the same amount of depressed. So a bad life event tends to make a woman as depressed as it does a man, but not more. The differences show up. Some of the difference is willingness to acknowledge negative feelings, but about half the difference turns out to be explained by the following. Women don't have more bad life events happen to them than men do. But it turns out that women are more likely to get depressed by bad things that happen to other people they care about. So your best friend is going through a horrendous divorce. Your sister lost a baby. Your mother is upset about something. Your girlfriend is going through, I don't know, she's being verbally abused by her boyfriend and you can't persuade her to dump him. Your brother is sick. And two things turn out to be true. One is women are more likely to know about bad things that happen to other people. That is, people are more likely to use women to confide in. And here I would say, think about your mothers or your aunts. Who does all the news go through? And again, in most families, it's not the man who gets on the phone, even with his own mother, to talk about problems in the family. It's his wife. And if she's a good daughter-in-law, she will spend the half hour talking to her mother-in-law about so-and-so is getting a divorce from so-and-so. And so women, there are two factors in this. Women are more likely to be upset by things that happen to other people when they do know about them. So if both men and women know that the man's sister has been diagnosed with a heart problem, the woman will actually be more depressed about it than the man will, and the woman is more likely to know about problems that happen to other people. So again, the tendency to depression is real, but it's something about the structural role that women play in families and in friendships and the kinds of communications that run through them that account for this difference. Okay, so let me say one more thing about this, which is that you're reading this week a very fun, very interesting book about class differences in child rearing. And I'll let you figure out what the argument is, although if you're keeping up with the reading, this really is one of the most engaging, interesting, and very well done studies you'll read. And you should be able to relate to it very well. One thing you should be thinking about while you're reading it is how much of the difference in styles of parenting between working class parents and middle class parents is due to something cultural that's a difference, you know, carried on by class and education and so forth between parents of these two sorts, and how much of it is that those families really live in different worlds, right? So that the working class families actually face very different constraints, and working class parents are trying to prepare their children for a very different kind of world than the middle and upper middle class parents are trying to prepare their children for. And those of you who come from immigrant families or from poor families, and you're the first college-going member of your family, may well experience this in the sense that your parents' attempts to advise you, to protect you, to tell you what kind of career you should have, you may come to feel are based on the fact that they that parent doesn't actually understand very well the kind of world you're moving into. So that your parent may think you need to have a very safe career with a very clear set of vocational skills, and you should become, you know, a dental hygienist or something because everyone has teeth, and so people will always need dental hygienists, and you're realizing, yeah, but whatever, corporate lawyers or finance capitalists or whatever make a lot more money. And so whatever these differences are, you want to think about this same set of issues that I've been talking about with respect to gender as we move into the study of social class. These really are similar problems, which is, to what degree are there really deeply embedded cultural differences in styles, skills, and habits, in skills and knowledge of the social world, but also in the structural situation, the worlds that people in different class situations confront. Okay, now I'm going to move to talking more directly about class. So I have to close this lecture and go down here and open the other lecture. Okay, and I have to go to the top. Whoops. Okay, so this is the lecture I should have been working on, lecturing about the whole time, but I have less than 20 minutes. Okay, and I will post this right after class, or, no, yeah, right after class. Okay, so class versus status attainment, categorizing in continuous models of inequality. I am going to try in 18 minutes to very rapidly summarize the way inequality, that is economic, social, political inequality, which sociologists call stratification. And stratification is the field that studies inequality of race, gender, ethnicity, even economic inequality. So all of that is, broadly speaking, the field of stratification. And I'm going to talk about how that was thought about in earlier periods of sociological theorizing and how it gets thought about more recently. Okay, and so this is the part that I would have gone into in some detail, but I'm not going to go into detail at all, except to show you a picture for a minute. So this is Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1948, and it was dominated by a set of big manufacturing industries, a middle-sized town. And all I'll say is that all these early studies, the things I have listed under A, and you do not have to memorize this, you do not have to know the names of these people, although if you read them, you will hear their names again and again. But I will say first that people like Lloyd Warner, who studied what he called Yankee City, but it was actually Newburyport, Massachusetts. The first part of this is they went into American small or medium-sized towns, something you could actually understand by going around talking to people about it. You might call it a more anthropological approach, and Warner actually was an anthropologist. And they found in a way, to their shock and dismay, that there really were classes in these towns. And often, in fact, there was a set of local, very elite families who came from blue blood backgrounds. Maybe they were old Dutch families, some of the first settlement in New York State, or maybe they were from old WASP New England stock that had come over on the Mayflower and were of from England, English descent. And they kind of ran the town. They were the really important people who mattered. And then there were the bankers and the owners of these big manufacturing plants, and they were the powers in the town. And then there was a kind of upper middle class group of doctors and lawyers and kind of people, professionals you might recognize. And then, you know, middle class white collar people, and then blue collar people with jobs in these industrial plants and so forth. And then a kind of underclass, people who were unemployed, alcoholics, didn't keep their children clean, and so forth. So Warner developed a kind of 7-class system for describing who existed out there in this community. Well, other sociologists and so forth came along, and the most important was this guy Hollingshead, so I'm going to talk about him for a second. And he studied, well, Elmtown's youth was actually about New Haven, Connecticut, which is where Yale University is. And so he was a sociologist at Yale, very, very influential in his day. And he developed a similar way of describing the families in New Haven. And I should say New Haven is not dominated by Yale. It's a big working class town that happens to have a university in it. So it's not like, it wouldn't be like, nobody would try to study Berkeley as typical of anything, but it made a lot more sense to study New Haven as if it were just a real city without a university in it. And he developed a 5-class system for describing class differences. Now, what he actually studied was the high school. So he could survey all the students, and there were something like 600 students in the high school, and so they all filled out a little questionnaire about their family background. So how educated their parents were, what jobs mostly their fathers had. He knew their own grades and sort of how well they were doing in school, what neighborhood they lived in, and some estimate of how much money the families made, and so forth. And based on that data, he grouped the students in this high school into 5 classes. And again, there was an upper class and an upper middle class and a middle class, upper working class, lower working class. So he had 5 classes. And then he tried to see how class influenced things. So it was actually, this 5-class system was widely used, so it could predict things like levels of mental health. There was a whole body of work that came out of his group that showed that working class people were more likely to develop psychoses, but not neuroses, and middle class people more likely to have neuroses. They could look at the way in which being from an upper class family advantaged you, so it turned out that having bad grades, but a family in class 1 or 2, you were more likely to go to college than having great grades, but being from a class 4 or 5 family, right? So they could look at all sorts of elements of stratification, who was advantaged and disadvantaged. But it turned out that that way of thinking about class had some big advantages and some big disadvantages. The big advantage, well, there are 2 really important ones that I'm going to emphasize. One of the big advantages is that that way of studying class got you closer to the way people themselves in the community thought about class. So how did kids in that high school actually regard each other? Who thought somebody was cool? Who would invite somebody to her birthday party? Well, and it turned out there was a lot of social segregation by class. So the kids from the top 2 classes socialized together, dated each other, hung out together, and they pretty much didn't invite kids from the classes beneath them. And here I don't mean freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, I mean his kind of ratings of these class groups to their parties. And you could show that the way people thought about each other was related to these class groups. And this was especially important in the Warner study, where he could focus on things like the fact that what distinguished the underclass, class 7, from the working class wasn't just whether the father in the family was employed. It was whether the children were well behaved and neatly dressed, whether the curtains were kept clean, whether the yard was mowed versus weeds grew everywhere. And you know this. You recognize this difference. If you have a block of very modest homes and some families put a broken down car in their front yard and make the whole neighborhood look terrible, and other people are trying to be respectable and they keep their houses neat and they repaint the front door periodically and they carefully trim their grass. There really is a difference, and it may not be directly related to income or education. It's related to how people behave. It's related to their style of life. And you could capture those elements of the system of inequality and status through these studies. The other thing you could capture through these early studies, which I am calling categorizing approaches, because they divided people into broad groups or categories, is that you could relate those categories to social and economic changes, right? So the upper class in Warner's study, and in many of these studies, was upper class for two reasons. Because it was from old money, that was one reason. Again, not working class Irish, but blue blood, whatever the New England origin, British origin population. And the other reason, because it actually controlled the major levers of economic and political power in the town, right? So owned the bank, owned the newspaper, owned the big factory. And you could see that class was really related to the role people played in the economy. People were working class because they had blue-collar jobs in a factory. And C. Wright Mills, in the book White Collar, really made a very important point that is related to these categorizing models of class. He pointed out that among people who are considered middle class, there were really two different kinds. And one was, if you want to talk about this, on the kind of cutting edge of economic change, and the other was on the declining edge. And these were the independent professionals and small businessmen. So this would be like a one-man law firm, a one-person medical practice, the person who owned the local hardware store, the person who owned the local grocery. And those people were gradually being swallowed up by a new economy that was emerging, a new corporate economy of big business, big stores, big everything. And the other group was the emerging professional middle class, and those were the lawyers who worked for big corporations, the people whose jobs were professionally oriented, the engineers and so forth who were working on big construction projects, and their future was growing. So these people might have been identical in their income, lived in the same neighborhood exactly, maybe their children played with each other, and they may even have had exactly the same educational credentials. That would have been true for the lawyer in the single-person firm and the corporate lawyer, maybe not for the small business owner, the person who owns the hardware store. But they would have very different politics, because one would be trying to defend a way of life that was being squeezed out by modern changes in the corporate world, and the other was gung-ho for those changes, which were expanding the opportunities for, usually it would be his family and his children for the future. So if you understood the structural situation these class groups were in, you could understand a lot about their politics. Now, then I'm going to talk about the disadvantages and why sociology moved basically full scale to a totally different way of thinking about things. And this whole categorizing approach made it very hard to really study differences between individuals and to answer in a systematic way the question of why some individuals succeed more or less than others do. And particularly, it made it hard to understand in a systematic way exactly how much the privileges or the disadvantages you get from your family background influence an individual's chances of occupational success. And as sociologists became interested in really trying to specify what affected the life chances of individuals, these ways of thinking became more and more frustrating. And I'll just point to the most obvious problem first, which is one person had a 7-class system, the other one had a 5-class system. You couldn't translate data from one study into another study because they hadn't coded the people in exactly the same way. In fact, if they had relied on informants, as many of these studies did, to rate every child in the high school, so you have every child fill out a questionnaire, but how do you know which class each person's in? You have to hire coders, basically, who have very complicated instructions to say, oh yes, this kid is class 3, and this one's class 4, and this one's class 2, and so forth. And they're not consistent from one time to the next, one study to the next. The categories aren't consistent, but also there are individuals who just don't fit. So you have these categories that really make sense intuitively. Upper class, upper middle class. What do you do about the man with a 6th grade education who made a fortune through a kind of semi-illegal trucking business, and he now has the biggest mansion in town? Is he class 1, class 2, class 3? Well, actually, he just doesn't fit anywhere. What do you do about the dissolute son of a very elite family from, you know, old money, who basically dropped out of college, never went back, lives off a tiny trust fund from his parents, drinks a lot, doesn't work at all? Is he class 1, class 2? You just can't, it's very, very hard. There are lots of individuals who don't fit. And it's just not very precise. So if you've got 5 classes, that, let's take class 3, which would be in the Hollingshead system probably the most problematic one, and that's something like, oh, I don't know, upper working class or something, or lower middle class, or middle class. Well, okay, so that class might include everyone from a person who sells insurance and does pretty well, local, maybe never went to college, but made good, was on the high school football team, is liked by everyone, reasonably successful. That's a small town career that actually at least used to make a lot of sense, probably still does for certain people. And it might include a retail clerk who makes very little money, the kind of person who these days would work at Walmart or Kmart, at that time would have worked at the Cresses, the 5 and Dime, the Woolworths. It might also include the dental hygienist. I don't actually think they had dental hygienists then, but that kind of a, so you've got a huge range of occupations in one class, and if somebody moves up from being the child of a retail clerk to being someone who maybe even owns his own insurance business, that won't show at all. That won't look like mobility in this scheme because this scheme is too crude to capture that. And finally, you can't really, because those categories build in things like education and occupation into the same category, that is, you get into class 4 by having a college education or more and an occupation of such and so type. You can't ask the questions sociologists became obsessed with, which are what is the relationship between people's educations and their occupations, right? You can't ask that question because you've built into your scheme that they go together. Well, then you can't ask how much they go, how much does the kind of education a person gets affect what occupation she has? And you just couldn't ask that question. So next time, I'm going to talk about the way sociologists came to study stratification.